Today is the second day where we are having sessions on discussing the book on the wealth of nations. The sessions began last week. Today we have a couple of sessions that we are going to go through. But briefly, to give ourselves a background, of course, the Wealth of Nations book, published in 1776, that's about 250 years old. Of course, the book has 33 chapters, and it has 5 books in one. So today we are looking at book 1. We continue on book 1 where we were, on the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labor. There are sessions that we had done last week. We did up to chapter 3. Today we begin our sessions from chapter 4. Chapter 4, yes, book 1. We'll have sessions in the morning and in the afternoon. In the morning, we will be dealing with the origin and use of money. We'll deal with the real and nominal price of commodities. We'll deal with the component parts of the price of commodities. We will also deal with the natural and the market price of commodities. So those are the 3 sessions we're going to deal with, chapters or books we're going to deal with today. That is chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. I have my colleagues with me who will be taking us through these chapters. Emmanuel will be taking us through the origin and use of money, which is chapter 4. My colleague Winnie will be taking us through real and nominal price of commodities. Moses will be taking us through the component parts of the price of commodities, and Vivian will come in to take us through the natural and market price of commodities. Our intention of going through the Adam Smith publications is, 1, to be able to ascertain whether the proclamations made then are relevant today, and do we agree with the proclamations? And we're also looking at what arguments and observations was Adam Smith making in relevance to today's contemporary world. So without much ado, allow me to welcome my colleague, Emmanuel, who will take us through the origin and use of money. Emmanuel.
So, what is money? I'll begin with a succinct definition. Money is a store of value, a unit of account, a medium of exchange. So, anything that performs these functions can be categorized as money. And we can differentiate between money and currency. The currency being that which is issued by some issuing organization, right? So historically, what Adam Smith observed, and Adam Smith uses a mix, I understand, of historical examples and then a thought experiment to demonstrate the origin and use of money. And what he has to say can best be thought of as making an observation about an emergent reality. So what Adam Smith is showing is, it's not that money, the origin, money had a linear origin, or that it had its origins in a specific society, but rather that mankind throughout history found use for, he wanted to find something with which he could store what value he had generate, account for it. He wants to be able to compare it to other things. And then he also wants to be able to trade. So another question that comes up is that what is it about trade? Why does trade exist in the first place? Well, trade is the alternative to war, to fighting over those resources. So we can decide to exchange, and trade can occur probably within a community where they know each other, so they've established rules. So how does money itself originate? You have what is called a double coincidence of wants. So Adam Smith observed that before having something like the currencies that we know and recognize today as money, that people first would engage in the production of what it is that they need, and then they find that they've produced in surplus, right? Something in a surplus amount, which simply means that this thing that I've produced, this value that I've produced, is in excess of what I need to meet my day-to-day needs. But there's something that I can use this value for, this surplus for. And what that is I can use it to consume all that which I myself cannot produce. So, for example, if you imagine uh, prehistoric, um, uh, a typical society in prehistoric times, when it's time to go and hunt something like a buffalo, everyone goes out together, because we can only hunt this large animal down as a group. It's easier. So the surplus in this case will be there's an excess of hunting skill that I cannot consume on my own. And so I exchange this in return for more meat, because we all go and hunt for this buffalo together. But now imagine that after getting my share of the buffalo, everyone has their own preferences of a mix of goods and services that they want to consume. Now you have a problem, because if let's say this is a society that's a society of hunter gatherers, or a society of people who are keeping livestock. Well, you have to have the exact, if you want pumpkins, you need to have the exact amount in livestock to exchange for those pumpkins. But you have the problem that the other individual with whom you want to exchange these pumpkins also should want those cows, the livestock that you want to give them. Now, that's the problem of the coincidence of wants, which is that our wants must coincide. And it's one of the principal problem that money solves. So human beings throughout time found use for something that could uh, solve the problem of the coincidence of wants. So you have a butcher. Adam Smith is observing this. So he walks probably around his town, and he sees there's a butcher and a baker. And each of them need to have an excess amount of what they produce, their bread or their meat. But they have a problem that they don't always want to consume bread, right? The butcher doesn't always want to consume bread. The baker doesn't always want to consume meat. And so they must find something else to mediate. Now, so then you have commodity money. So society finds, okay, which goods do we have in excess amount, right? That everyone has, they're easy to find. They sort of are stable, that they don't deteriorate quickly. And everyone would want that commodity. That's why it's a commodity, it's common. That in was different things in different societies, but for one, it was different kinds of grain. it could be corn, it could be rice if that's in Japan. So if someone works for me, I pay them, and they will want to be paid in that corn because they know that they can use that corn to buy something else, because everyone will want corn. So that's how commodity money solves the problem of double coincidence of wants. But now notice, with corn, rice, and these kind of commodities, they're more durable than, say, fruits, right? They don't spoil quickly. That's what made them desirable. But societies time and time again found use for something a bit more durable. So that's when metals came into play. And what you have with metals is you have a commodity, everyone wants the metals, and you can cut them up and carry them around and exchange. Now, the problem that metals, you can take them, you can divide them up, right? They have that divisibility, they're durable, and then they're fungible because they're also a commodity. Anyone wants them, fungibility. But the problem is that every time someone exchanges metal bars for whatever good or service they want, the person receiving the bars has to weigh them. Not only do they have to weigh them, but they also have to be reassure themselves of the quality of that metal, because that metal could have imperfections in it that make it so that it's not as valuable as it should be. So that's the problem of assaying, of testing purity. Testing purity can also be quite, you have to melt it down with chemicals. So that risk of adulterated metal was very real. So, what was the next solution? If you had a central authority that guaranteed this money, maybe by putting a stamp on it, well, now you get the next iteration of money, right? So governments were trying to guarantee both the weight and the quality of this metal. But then now we got into another enduring problem, which was that governments, which were in many cases chieftains or princes, they're the ones putting the stamp on the money. But sometimes they might actually themselves devalue the money. Why? If I borrow money, but I'm the one who puts the stamps on it, well, when it's time to pay back, I could actually give back lower quality money. So actually, I've stolen from you because you lent to me, but I gave back a lower amount. So on the one hand, money the government helped to solve the problem of having to weigh and assay the quality of metal, but then introduced another problem. So, now you could accept money just by counting it. But then they introduced the problem of inflation, an inflationary monetary policy. Then finally, the value in use versus the value in exchange. So sometimes uh, you have other things that just couldn't serve as money, even though they had high value. So, for example, water. Water has high value, but it's very cheap. So it has a low value in exchange. Why does water have a low value in exchange? Because at given points in time, there's only so much water I want. Not only is there so much water I want, it has its own problems with how do you store the water when you don't need it. Diamonds, on the other hand, you cannot do anything with them except, maybe breaking, the recent a use that really emerged with the industrial society, which is breaking hard rock. But diamonds have a very, very high value in exchange. So you put all this together and you can see that money came about because man was finding himself with this need to measure an exchange. So, for example, you have 500 goats, I have 2 cows, and I always have to keep that exchange rate. If I want something else, I have to, should I measure this in terms of cows or should I measure it in terms of goats? And then if I'm measuring in terms of cows or goats, but there's someone else who doesn't want either of them, now I have to transfer and change it and measure it in terms of pumpkins. Not only do I have to do all that, but now I have to make sure that the person who has pumpkins actually wants my goats or my cows. In addition to that, I want to be able to keep this value for a long time. And while livestock is preferable against compared to a pumpkin, right? You know, you even have accounts of maybe whether it's warriors in ancient Greece buying and selling their armor, and this guy's armor costs 100 cows while this one's costs 2. Um, and you have similar examples all across the planet. But money emerged time and time again because it had properties that were superior to all these others. Thank you.
Thanks, Manny, for taking us through the origin of money and just unpacking to us so that we understand Adam Smith's perspective on the origin of money. So the chapter I'll be looking at is part of book 1, chapter 5, which speaks of the real and nominal price of commodities, or their price in labor and their price in money. So in this chapter, Adam Smith he begins by making an observation, and the observation he's making is that in societies that are developing or that are developed, people depend heavily on each other. So I will depend on somebody else for the provision of a service or a good, and that person could also depend on me for the provision of a service or a good. So in a nutshell, what he is saying is that you don't necessarily produce what you consume. Somebody else would be producing what you consume. And in making a judgment, he says that when we are speaking of wealth, we should not just look at wealth in terms of what somebody owns, but we should look at wealth in terms of the level of labor somebody commands. So in looking at the level of labor somebody else can command, we are looking at how much goods and services somebody can afford to buy. Okay, so in a nutshell, he's just trying to make us understand that the true value of things is not necessarily money, but the labor that goes into whatever service or good that you are purchasing. And then, so in plain terms, what Adam Smith is saying that when you're buying something, what you are exchanging in reality is not really just the money, but you're also exchanging the amount of work, which is the labor that money represents. So the real cost of anything is the effort, the time, the hard work that is required to produce or to earn whatever it is. So to help us understand what this argument about labor and money really is, he goes step by step. And in his first step, he's just saying, what I will reiterate what I said, is that he says people don't produce everything they need themselves. In a society where there is division of labor, person A will produce what person B needs, and person B will produce what person C needs, and the chain continues, okay? So your wealth is not about how much you own, but it's about how much of other people's labor you could actually purchase, right? And then in that sense, he also goes ahead to try and distinguish Now that we understand there's a component of labor and there's a component of money in his argument, he wants to distinguish these two. And in distinguishing, he brings in the component of real price and the nominal price. And when he's speaking about the real price, he is speaking about the labor required to get something. And then when he speaks about the nominal price, he is speaking about the money that is required for you to pay for the labor. So Adam Smith explains that despite the fact that we still use money in everyday life, we only use it because it is more practical. People understand prices in money more easily than they would understand how abstract units of labor is. And so when he's speaking about labor, for example, he gives examples of, for instance, corn. And he says, corn today, during that time, but let's use today, corn today, a ton of corn today is equivalent to a ton of corn tomorrow. But the amount of money that is used to purchase that corn today might not be the same, or might not be the same as the amount that will be used to purchase the corn tomorrow. And then he also goes ahead to further explain that, during that time it was gold and silver, and so the price of that corn, which is the nominal price, largely depended on how the mines operated. So if a new mine was emerged, then of course there was more silver or gold, meaning prices would go down. There's no scarcity, but there's no scarcity of gold and silver. But if there is scarcity of the gold and silver, then of course, purchasing the same barrel of corn would be more expensive. So in a nutshell, that is what he is saying. So the question Jotham mentioned that we would be asking ourselves today is, if Adam Smith was to write The Wealth of the Nations today, would it actually make sense if we are looking at the real and nominal price of commodities? And so if we are to connect his ideologies to Kenya today, and I want to use the example of rising fuel prices, the relevance is quite clear. So he argues that the real price of things is labor, which is the effort needed to earn them, while money is just the label, which is what we are using to acquire that labor. So now we think of Kenya and we bring ourselves to notice that when the fuel prices go up, it's not just the price of petrol that goes up. Petrol does not just become expensive. What really changes is how much work people need to put to afford that fuel. For instance, if a week ago, if you are buying fuel, let's say, for example, 5 liters of fuel for 1,000 shillings, I believe today, if you went with the 1,000 shillings to buy the same amount of fuel, it's not possible. What that means is you have to put in more work for you to be able to purchase more for you to be able to purchase fuel equivalent to what you were purchasing previously. So let's look at a boda rider, for example. That boda rider now has to work more hours, for example, to buy the same liters of petrol. Winnie Ogejo, who is a salaried worker, has to spend a larger share of her income on commuting. So if Winnie was using, my commute has not changed because my commute is still from South B to Upper Hill, but the fare is not the same because it has gone up because of the fuel prices. Then we look at it from the household level, and we're looking at it in terms of food prices. And what we are saying is, because the fuel prices have gone up, we are experiencing food prices also going up. And this is largely because of increased transport costs. And so this means that households have to spend much more than they were spending to eat the same meals. And so for them to also, in spending much more, it means they have to put in more labor for them to be able to command more, to have the same purchasing power. So what Smith is telling us in a nutshell, and I agree with his arguments, even if we were to contextualize it to today's realities, what Smith is telling us is we should not just look at prices. What we should be doing is ask what they represent in real human effort and purchasing power, so that we are being brought to the realization that the 1,000, if you walked into a Carrefour, for example, 2 years ago, with 1,000 shillings, what you left with that 2 years ago cannot be the same with what you will live with today. It means you have to put in more effort for you to have access to more money, for you to match that purchasing power. And then we also look at it in terms of things are not truly expensive because of their prices, but they're expensive because of how much work you must do to afford that commodity. So we were just having a discussion, and my colleague Moses was mentioning that a millionaire in Uganda, for example, would argue that they are very wealthy. And then, of course, if you compare them with somebody who just has 100,000 in Kenya, then you realize that their wealth is actually a conversation that needs to be had, because what they can purchase with what they have as a millionaire and what I can purchase as a Kenyan with 100,000 shillings is much more. I can actually buy more than he who thinks he's a millionaire back in Uganda. So there's that concept of understanding real values and the nominal values of things. And his argument still holds, because even today, when we hear people reporting prices, the first question, especially here at the Institute, that we ask ourselves, the figure that has been reported, is it being reported in nominal value, or is it being reported in real value? Because in real value, if it is being reported in real value, then it paints a true picture, because a lot of factors such as inflation have been factored in. But in nominal terms, it is just plain as is. Taking us back, and Moses will be coming in to go more in depth into some of the variables that that Smith continues to speak about in consequent chapters. And so when you're speaking nominal and real values, we can't look at them the same. His argument is that real value includes the labor, and the nominal is just the price. And the price, because of the fact that it is not very stable, is not very accurate. But the real value, which is labor, what if I am to earn at $1,000 in an hour, my hour is constant. It is just the amount of work that I put in that actually matters. If I put in my 1 hour, I will earn that 10,000. But somebody else who wants to buy my time would actually have to work extra hard for them to get that $1,000 to buy my 1 hour. So that's the argument Adam Smith is making. And as we will be having a conversation, we will be noticing that, yeah, the relevance is still there. If he was to make the same arguments, despite technological advancements and all these changes that we have experienced, the argument still really holds. There's a very distinct difference between the nominal values and the real price values. So in a nutshell, Jotam, that's an analysis of my chapter. Thank you.
So on this chapter of the components or parts of the price of commodities, Adam Smith intended to answer just one simple question: what goes into determining the price of commodities? So in this chapter, Adam Smith also paints two pictures, and one is on before people owned capital, or let's say land and non-land resources. And then afterwards, when now there was private ownership of land and also non-land resources in this case. So what I'll do here is go into what Adam Smith actually wrote and some of the observation he made, and then we'll ask ourselves at the very end whether this matches also what goes into the prices of commodities today. Now, before people owned land and before people had accumulated non-land resources which go into production, the price of something was just determined by the labor that was used to get it. Now, the simplest way, as Adam Smith spells out in this chapter, to determine labor is the time spent. So he argues that a price of a commodity is equal to actually the labor it requires. For example, if it requires twice the labor to hunt a beaver compared to a deer, then one beaver is equivalent to 2 deers. So if you are taking 1 hour to hunt a deer, but you need 2 hours to hunt a beaver, what it means, in the same times one person has hunted a beaver, the other person could have hunted 2 deers. And therefore, if we are in the market and we want to exchange a deer for a beaver, then what it means is that the owner of a beaver will require 2 deers from the other person so that they have a 1-to-1 exchange. Now, remember that in this argument, Adam Smith points out that one of the assumptions is the 1-to-1 exchange. So the determinant of price was time spent, which in this case is labor. So how much time did you spend to produce anything? But there were 2 other exceptions where time spent necessarily did not exchange for 1-to-1 with another time. And Adam Smith argues that some things needed superior skills and something exposed the person offering the labor to superior hardship. Now, superior skills in this case means how much the ability to perform difficult tasks, especially coming to speed, to particular with your hands, or some of being clever or original, inventive in doing things. So in a place where production of something required some skills or it had difficulties more than it would be normally considered, then the 1-to-1 exchange was not used. In this case, for example, if you required a special skill maybe to craft something and you used an hour, it wasn't equivalent to somebody who did not require special skill but also produce something within an hour. So there was a different metric to that. Now, and this I'm quoting directly, Adam Smith notes that in the advanced state of society, allowance of this kind for superior hardship and superior skills are commonly made in the wages of labor, and something of the same kind must probably have taken place in its earliest and rudest period. So what Adam Smith notes is people who could express or who possessed superior skills or who could do work that required superior hardship were able to accumulate more wages for their labor compared to people who did not. And in that case, they didn't exchange their labor on 1-to-1 basis. Now, post-ownership. Now, remember, this is times where the only thing that people had to offer is their labor. Season changed and now resources became private. And in this case, we have land and then we have non-land resources. Now, Adam Smith calls non-land resources stock. Now, as soon as stock was accumulated in the hands of some people, some of these people now would employ other people, people who are hardworking, so that they give them the materials and they also sustain their life. So giving them the subsistence as written by Adam Smith. And then these people now, since they have the material and their daily requirement are catered for by these people who have accumulated stock. Now, these people can be able to produce something. One, when they add value to the materials they have been given, and number two, because their welfare is well taken care of by these owners of stock, then their time is freed up to produce these particular things. Now, when the owner of stock required that whoever they have employed to do this generates an output, this is output of labor that was enough not only to pay them, but also to be able to enable the owner of stock to accumulate profit. Now, this was the second component that went into prices. Remember, the first determinant of price was just labor. How much time did somebody take into it, with an exception of people who had superior skills and people who experience superior difficulty when producing something. The next thing that came is now the profit for stock. Now, the commodity which were produced now using labor and there was stock invested into it by somebody, the price into which other people were required to pay to obtain the produce of that labor would account for the wages of labor and also the stock, the profit that is required of the stock that was invested into it. Now, unlike now in where there was a one-to-one exchange, in the first case where only labor went into it, now this additional component of the invested stock had to be accounted for in the prices. The third thing is land. And Adam Smith notes that before land was public, so nobody necessarily owned it. It was owned by everybody. And therefore, if you were a hunter, you didn't need to pay for a license to hunt, you just went hunting. Or if you were using grass on the land to produce whatever you're producing, you didn't need to pay anybody to do it. But the moment land became private, it meant for anybody to use land to do production, they needed to pay a certain fee, which in this case is called rent, to the owner of the land for them to allow them to utilize the land in production. Now, the person who has rented the land to do production, when they produce, the commodities they produce, the prices on which they are going to charge on them need to account for the wages of the person doing the production and also the rent of the person who owns the land. Now, the real value of different component of prices include wages, profit, and rent. So by wages here, we mean what quantity of labor went into producing this, and what profits were required by the owner of stocks, and what rent was required by the owner of land. Now, for example, let's look at the value chain of corn. Now, at the farm level, let's assuming that in this case that corn is produced on land that is owned by somebody else. So the price of corn was dependent on how much rent the person had to pay to the landlord, the owner of the land, how much wages and maintenance of laborers that were working on the same needed, including laboring cattle, which in this case was the machinery that was used in farming. And then what is the profit that the farmer needs? And also what was the cost of the stock they invested, and also what is the cost of the wear and tear. So that went into the price of corn. Now, once corn is produced and it's sold at the farm, the millers now take it to turn it into corn flour. So in addition to the cost incurred by the farmer, the miller has to have additional cost that they're going to be added into the pricing. And that is the profit for the miller, the wages of the servants the miller has employed, and also the labor of transporting this corn to the miller. So remember, the miller accrued the cost that they paid for corn, whether it's directly to the farmer or to whoever transported it. Now, when they mill it into corn flour, they have to account for the cost they incurred in the milling process. So the price of corn flour is going to go up depending on the cost incurred by the miller. On the third level is bread. Now we had corn, it was milled into corn flour, and now we have a baker who is going to process it into bread. And now the baker also has to account for additional costs they incurred. Remember, the baker bought corn flour. In the corn flour, the prices of corn was accounted for. Now the baker has to account for the profits of the baker. They have to account for the wages of their own servants, and also the labor of transporting the corn flour to their own bakery. So prices include all the cost incurred at each stage. And it's good to note, as Adam Smith writes, that profit increases as the risk taken moves up. So remember, the person buying corn from the farmer need to take the risk that actually there will be need for corn flour. and that they will transport it successfully, and they will incur the cost of transporting. And therefore, by the time they have milled and sold it, they'll need a return on all these risks they have taken. And therefore, they are likely to accrue more profits than the farmer accrued because of the additional risk that they took. And also the baker is likely to make more profit in this case because they also have to take additional risk. And not only that, they need to have beforehand additional capital so that they are able to buy the flour and to be able to pay their servant before they actually sell their bread. Now, Adam Smith noticed something in society, that not everybody who had stock directly employed it into production. Some people would wish to give their stock to other people to produce at a fee. And now in this case, the other component that goes into prices is the interest from the person who has taken credit. So if a person lends their stock instead of employing it directly, then they earn interest to those. And Adam Smith says, and I quote, "The interest of money is always a derivative revenue, which if it's not paid from the profit which is made from the use of this money, must be paid from other source of revenue. And unless perhaps the borrower is a spendthrift who contracts a second debt in order to pay the interest of the first." So Adam Smith notes that some people's stock, which is in money, they would not want to employ it directly into production. And therefore, they give somebody else who is willing to do the same. But this person who is taking the money has to ensure that they produce enough and sell it at a profit level that will enable them not only to make profit for themselves, but also to be able to repay the additional cost, which is the interest, to whoever lended them the money. So if anybody lends money and they're not able to produce enough to make profits high enough for themselves and also to pay interest, it means they'll have to accrue another debt to be able to pay the first person they owe, which in this case, Adam Smith calls them a spendthrift. And he notes that this is not as sustainable. So Adam Smith notes this, and I quote, that all taxes and all the revenue which is founded upon them, like salaries, pension, and annuities of every kind, are ultimately derived from someone or other of those three original sources of revenue, and are paid either immediately or mediately from the wages of labor, the profit of stock, or the rent of land. So in Adam Smith, what he's saying here is, if you have a commodity and it's been sold at a certain amount of money, then what you can truly know is that the amount you have to pay for this commodity includes what was paid to the laborers, what profit was accrued to the stock owners, and what was paid in form of rent to the landowners. So what could this chapter maybe tell us about Africa or Kenya in this case? 4 things that probably we can derive from this. And number one, that is that, as Adam Smith argued, that nobody is going to employ their stock to production unless they'll make a profit, and nobody is going to lend their money unless they're going to make an interest. It tells you that for Africa or for Kenya to attract investment, then that is dependent on whether the environment will allow people to make profits. So profit is the incentive that will make people invest their time, their stock, or their land into production. Now, also Adam Smith notes that all this component that goes into prices, it tells you how much risk were taken, what costs were accrued, how much interest was needed to borrow. And therefore, if societies or countries in this case decide to control the price and they control it below what the cost or the risk that whoever is investing is taking, then people will not be attracted to invest. And that is on the question of debt. Adam Smith says that if anybody takes debt and invest it in production that will not create enough profit both to repay the debt, the interest, and also profit whoever invested it, then this person will be required to take another debt to repay the old debt. And this should be the prudency mark under which anybody taking debt needs to imply, whether it's an individual, as a private investor, or as a nation, that you need to consider the fact that if this debt will not generate enough production or output, then maybe necessarily this is not a good debt to take. Lastly, one of the major arguments in this country, especially in Kenya, is that farmers are exploited because, like a very common example used, a plate of rice will be probably more expensive than a certain weight of potatoes. And therefore, people will assume because of that differential in prices, the farmer is being exploited by people in the value chain. But if you follow the argument, which is truly true, that Adam Smith points out in this topic or chapter, you realize that prices also account for all the cost that went into something. And since whoever is making fries has taken more risks and also needed more capital to be at that level, and therefore, whatever looks like they are making what would be maybe considered quote unquote evil profits is not necessarily true if you consider this chapter. And that's the end of this chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moses, for that elaborate part. So I'll come to chapter 7 of the natural and the market price of commodity. So Moses have explained to us the amount that includes all the factors of production. And in chapter 7, now Smiths come in to explain to us now what is that price, how is it called, and compares it to the market price. So he brings us into the market. Now, the price that Moses has explained in chapter 7, it is called the natural price. So what is the natural price? So this is basically the normal price of a good. So it reflects the full cost of production. Moses has explained the cost of production, that is the reward for labor, which is wages. We have profit, that is the return on capital. Then we have the rent for land. So at this particular price, what we see is that it is the equilibrium price. So at this point, a product is sold at, if a product is sold at this point, everyone involved, that is the buyer and the seller, is earning their usual or expected return. No one is making abnormal gains or losses. So that is why it is referred to as the equilibrium price. Now, he brings another concept of the market price. What is the market price? This is the actual price you see in the market at any given time. So it depends on two things. Number one, how much is available, which is supply, and how many people are willing and able to pay. So he gives two key distinctions that I agree with. We have effectual demand and absolute demand. So what is effectual demand? So this is a demand with power. This is the desire for a commodity, and it is backed up with by ability or willingness to pay. So that is effectual demand, a demand with power. So this is a demand where someone is willing and also able to pay for a particular commodity. Then we have absolute demand. This is a want for a good with no ability to pay for it. Let us look at some of the examples in Kenya. We have affordable housing. Everyone wants to stay in a good house. Everyone wants to stay in those houses that are being built under affordable housing. But that is absolute demand. Not everyone is able, or not everyone can afford those houses. So it brings the fact that houses are available, the people are willing, everyone wants. If they could be given at a freely, everyone could wish to stay in those particular houses. But since they don't have the ability and willingness to pay, so it makes that demand absolute, not effectual. Then now let us come to why market prices moves. So Smith explains three concepts. So the first concept is if supply is less than demand, what happens in the market? So if goods that are brought in the market does not meet the demand, they are less than the demand, prices tend to rise above the natural price. Remember, we say the natural price is the equilibrium price. So if supply is less than demand, prices rises above the natural price. This is because many people will be willing to pay more for the few goods that are available. Now, when now supply is greater than demand, so there's excess supply, what will happen here? Prices will fall below the natural price. So when I speak about the natural price, this is the equilibrium price. So in this point, what happens, he gives two distinctions. When goods are perishable, they are likely to be sold at faster and at a lower price if the supply is excess as compared to demand. So prices of perishable goods tend to fall much faster when there's excess supply than durable goods. So I gave an example of an orange. Farm products, for example, they are perishable. So when the supply is excess, so their prices will tend to fall at a faster rate as compared to non-perishable good, because producers will be willing to sell them at that lower price than allowing them to go bad. We can look at an example. When you go to the lake regions, for example, you find that when fishermen comes in the morning, the prices are a bit higher because they still have the whole day to sell and the demand is a bit low during that time. So when it reaches in the evening, you find most people, they have the stock they have not sold maybe throughout the day. The supply is excess more than the demand that is required in the market. And because they don't have storage facilities, and we know that fish is perishable, so they'll sell it at a lower price possible to meet the demand. Then for a non-perishable good like iron, for example, for this, the supplier can even choose to keep it for some times until prices get to a certain level. But for perishable good, they are really much affected when supply is excess. Then now in this third scenario, when supply is equal to demand, now at this point, it is at the equilibrium point. It is at the natural price. Now he comes to another point. It tells us about now the self-correcting mechanism. We have seen there's some point in the market where supply or prices goes above the natural price. At some points, it goes below. So the market has a way of correcting itself. How does it do that? So when the prices are higher than the natural price, what will happen? It will attract more producers, supply will increase, then what will happen? Prices will fall. So take for example, there are two markets in a certain area. So in one market, maybe 2 kgs of maize goes for 200 shillings, and there's another market where 2 kgs go for 100 shillings. So the sellers in this market where 2 kgs is 100 shillings, when they hear about that market that people are selling the same 2 kg at a higher price, what they'll do the following day or the following market day, they will go to that market to sell at that particular price, because high prices attract more producers or more suppliers. So when they get there, there'll be more supply, and therefore prices will tend to fall. Now, when there's low prices, producers exit the market. Supply decreases and prices rise. So when there's low prices, no producer is willing to sell at a low price that they are making losses. So most of them will exit the market. They will stop producing those particular goods and services. Then supply will decrease. Then what happens? Prices will rise. So that is the self-correcting mechanism that happens in a free market. Then he comes and explain again, some prices sometimes can stay above the natural price for a long time, even centuries. So why is this so? Why do this happen? So it happens due to two main reasons. The two main reasons he explains that I agree with is scarcity due to nature. So some goods are inherently limited. Like we have rare land, there's some unique soil that can only produce a given quantity of goods, or a given quantity of a specific good, then special product. So at this point, when scarcity is due to nature, supply can never fully meet demand. And when there's shortage in supply, what happens is prices will be above the natural price. So prices so this results to a situation where prices stay permanently over, or maybe over a long period of time, above the natural price, and most of the extra gains goes to the rent or landowners. Number two, we have monopoly and restrictions. So when a market is experiencing monopoly and restriction, when competition is restricted through monopolies, licenses, and laws, what result is that producers artificially limit supply. So in cases of monopoly, supply is limited. In cases of restriction that we know here in Kenya, for example, prices of petroleum are being restricted by the authority. So in case of that restriction, we normally find that our petroleum prices are above the natural price, which is the equilibrium price, due to restrictions. So you notice that restrictions tend to keep prices above the natural price. Then it brings a certain concept that in as much as we have seen that prices can stay above or below, in most cases, prices can stay above the natural price for a long time, but his observation also states that they rarely stay below the natural price. Why? Why is this so? So when losses occur, when producers are producing at a lower price, or they're selling their production at a lower price, so it means that they incur losses and they're forced to exit the market. Then what happens? Supply shrinks, prices go back to normal. So basically when prices are lower, producers tend to exit the market very fast because they rather exit and not sell at a lower price that they are making losses. So this then reinforces the idea that we have seen initially of self-correction, but normally it happens in one direction, more strongly in one direction as compared to the other. Then he concludes by criticizing, or he warns against regulation and labor restrictions. So he points out that laws like apprenticeships and corporations, they act as partial monopolies and they can keep wages at and profits artificially very high, or sometimes distort the labor market. So, but most importantly, he concludes by saying that these distortions are more effective at raising prices than lowering them. So when there's regulation and restrictions, it tends to raise the prices and not lower them. So that's the conclusion he makes in this chapter. So we have seen that it tells us that while the market price tends to gravitate towards the natural price. So when they are high, the self-correcting mechanism takes them back to the natural price. Then they can remain persistently above due to scarcity and monopoly and restrictions. Then, however, we have seen that they rarely remain below the natural because losses tend to force supply adjustment. So that's all about the 7th chapter. More explanation will come in the next chapter, chapter 8. Thank you.
Allow me to take this opportunity to open this up to all the presenters. That is Vivian, Emmanuel, Winnie, and Moses. I'm just creating an opportunity for you to give your individual final remark on your observations on your relevant chapters. And do so, we want you to do so and try to share your experience or your feeling. Are the proclamations made by Adam Smith relevant today? Or do we agree with the proclamations? Remember, these were publications of over 250 years ago, and you're looking at them in today's contemporary world. What is your take as part of your closing remark? So probably I would want to go with the order of things, the way they were. I'll begin with Emmanuel. Emmanuel, in a few words, what was your take?
Yes. So my take is this. It remains true to this very day that quote unquote princes, or in more precise terms, governments do steal wealth through inflationary practices, and they engage in inflationary practices because of their excessive borrowing. So this, it remains, even to this day, 250 years later, something to be concerned about and to follow on and to remain vigilant about. So my chapter covered the origin and use of money. We still find money useful today. And again, one important point of emphasis is that it is still incumbent upon citizens to guard against the inflationary practice of the prince. Thank you.
Yeah, so you look at the ideologies and the arguments Adam Smith was making, and the greatest question that not only at the Institute, I want to believe a lot of people who've read The Wealth of the Nations by Adam Smith have asked themselves that 250 years later, if Adam Smith was to write the same ideologies today, would they make sense? Would we use those arguments to sort of justify some economic notions that we have? So, for example, in our discussions earlier, there was a conversation around how wealthy nations are, and the suggestion that those that are not wealthy can then print more money to make them richer. And so if you follow the chapter 5 of the real and nominal price of commodities, or the price in labor and the price in money, then you realize that printing more money, by a nation printing more money, does not really make its economy richer. The economy just becomes richer on paper, but the reality is it increases, it makes a nation richer on paper, but it doesn't increase the nation's real wealth. Why does it not increase the nation's real wealth? Because if you follow those arguments that he's making in chapter 5, you realize that money is of exchange. It is hinted by Emmanuel. And then when you want to look at the real wealth in the real wealth, then you have to look at the goods and services a country produces or that it can command. So you have to look at it from a point of food, as given the examples Vivian gave: food, housing, energy, education, just looking at how well it's doing in those areas. So basing off those arguments, we realize that when a government prints more money, it increases the nominal value, and the nominal value in this sense is we have more currency in circulation. But the big question we should be asking is, with the more currency in circulation, or with more money in circulation, does it increase the real value? Does it increase the output of an economy? And not just output per se, the actual output of the economy. Because people may have more cash, but they're not able to purchase, because their purchasing power hasn't improved despite having more money circulating or whatever. So we should actually be looking at the nominal and the real value. When we insist on people looking at real values as opposed to nominal values, it is because of the changes that happen that affect nominal values. And so if you incorporate those changes, then we get ourselves to experience the real value of goods and services. So your question, Jotham, is yes, it really makes sense, even today, to just have a look at the Wealth of the Nations and just understand the arguments he was making, because they are very, very evident even in present day.
Well, I'll start by saying that given that this observation was made 250 years ago, and truly it remains relevant, and it's also true to this day, it tells us that the economic knowledge and idea, those especially expressed and documented clearly in this manner, are relevant today. And it's a risk when a country especially distorts the price mechanism. Adam Smith observed carefully that the price mechanism is not evil, as claimed in some of today's countries' policy stance, but it incentivizes production, it incentivizes investment, it also incentivizes people to lend money to others for the sake of this. And therefore, for society to optimize its investment and production, then it needs to respect the price mechanism. And I think that's a great deal of a lesson that Kenyans and African countries, most especially those who have adopted mechanism to control prices, should learn in this case. Because at the end of the day, for us to optimize our production to ensure that people have the incentive to produce and people have the incentive to invest, then the price mechanism is one of the things that needs not to be interfered with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this principle, actually, they still apply today. And what I can summarize is that a wealthy or a wealth of a nation is comprises of how many people have the effectual demand. So I can remember sometimes back in this country, there was a publication that there are some people in the same country are starving while others are having excess. So the reason why that happen is because they are starving, yes, but they don't have the effectual demand. They have absolute demand, and absolute demand does not have power to command goods from one place to another. Because just as Moses told us in chapter 6, is that for a producer to produce certain things or for them to sell, they must consider all the costs that are involved. So imagine taking a good from Kisumu maybe to Turkana, transportation cost, the production cost, then only to take it at a free cost. So it does not, the absolute demand does not have power to command that good from one place to another. So these observations or these rules, they still apply to date, and we see them in our day-to-day interaction. Even those who enter the business, you cannot sell your product when you know you are making a loss. So you must take into account all the cost of production and make sure that at the end of it all, you are earning an expected return. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vivian, and thanks, colleagues, for this insightful session. We have delved significantly into Book 1 of the Wealth of Nations. We've covered Chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7. The series continues. We'll be having more series coming on our way. But to my colleagues, thank you very much.